Wonderful. I'm so happy to see all of you, and Rabbi Arthur Waskow. Thank you for being here with us with our Jewish Ecological Leadership Fellowship. And Rabbi Arthur Waskow, doctor, PhD, wrote the original Freedom Seder in 1969 and a number of adaptations of it in the years since. He founded in 1983 and continues to direct the Shalom Center in Philadelphia. Among his 28 books are Seasons of Our Joy, which is how I was first introduced to you, Down to Earth Judaism, The Tent of Abraham, God Wrestling, Round 2, and he was the editor of Torah of the Earth. And most recently, Dancing in God's Earthquake, The Coming Transformation of Religion. So with all of that glorious lived action, thank you so much for being here. And we're all here together to jump in.
Okay, I will. But I want to begin, as we're taught, I'll say a little bit about why we might be taught, with a bracha that affirms that the learning of Torah is a mitzvah. I asked Talmud teacher, whose name I'm going to blank on, unfortunately, at the moment, why he thought the rabbis taught that we should say this. He said, well, I think they knew perfectly well that they could get addicted to the study of Torah, and they would forget to go home and make love to their wives. They would forget to daven 3 times a day. They would forget even to give tzedakah. So they would try to remind themselves that the learning of Torah was a mitzvah among the mitzvot, and the whole network of the mitzvot was what was important. There's one story about them that I think is the perfect example. A bunch of the rabbis were hiding in an attic from the Roman army. If you only think Anne Frank hid in an attic from a oppressive, genocidal army. A bunch of them, including Rabbi Akiva, were hiding because Rome had decreed the death sentence for either studying Torah or doing deeds that were defined by Torah. So they started talking, not in an ivory tower sense, but for real. Which one are you willing to risk your life for? Which is more important, studying or doing Torah? Finally, Akiva said, which is greater, study or action? Study if it leads to action. All the other sages said, yeah, you got it, that's right. So I want to do whatever is possible to do along that line here. My grandmother taught me Hebrew when I was 11 to get ready to become bar mitzvah. And we did ba, ba, be, and then words, and then sentences. And then we came to a sentence that had yud, hey, wo, hey in it. And she said, that's Adonai. I said, Grandmom, you just taught me a daled, and it's not there. You just taught me a nun, and it's not there. It can't be Adonai. She said, I know, just do it. Whew. Well, I just did it for about 40 years. And then the story is too long to explain. I found myself trying to pronounce Yud Hey Vav Hey the way it's written, with no vowels. It's not Yahweh, not Yahovah, just Yud Hey Vav Hey, just YHWH. So I want to pause for a minute and let anybody who's willing to disobey my grandmother and 2,000 years worth of rabbis try to pronounce Yud Hey Vav Hey with no vowel. Okay, so what happened to me was a breath. And the first thing I thought was, well, that makes sense. At least one of the real names of the real God who we say is Echad, one, shouldn't be just in Hebrew or Egyptian or Greek or Latin or English or Russian or Swahili or Chinese, but in all of them. And the only sound in every human language is just breathing. And the second thing that occurred to me was, Waskow, it's not just human languages. Every living being on the planet breathes. And what's more, we don't breathe in a little bubble, each one of us alone, but we breathe each other. Plants and animals breathe each other. We exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen. And that changed my whole view. Just rubbing out the notion of substituting Lord Adonai and King Melech, because the breath is an ecological way of understanding the world, not a domination way, a hierarchical way. And it took me a couple of years to get this piece. The crisis we're in is a crisis because we've invented artificial ways of making more CO2 than all the plants on the planet can turn into oxygen. So the CO2 builds up and up and up, and it heats up and scorches the planet. And it makes what we call the climate crisis, which in depth is a crisis in God's name. It's a crisis in the Yod-Heh. Well, hey. So I want to do the bracha that's supposed to precede learning Torah, but which I've now put some of the learning of Torah first. I want to say that bracha with that depth of understanding. Baruch atah Eloheinu Ruach haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvot v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. And together we say, Amen.
Amen.
In the 10 assertions at Sinai, one is, do not take my name in vain, empty-hearted, empty-headed. I don't think that means never say, oh my God, or Jesus, or some similar. But I think what it means is every breath you take is my name. Don't take it empty-headed, empty-hearted. Don't take any breath empty-headed, empty-hearted. Try to be aware that each breath coming is part of, not comes from, is part of the great breath of all life, which keeps this planet alive. And for us today, I hope we'll have time for conversation. We should be making the conversation and aiming toward wisdom. Torah is a word that means aiming in the language of archery. Doesn't mean the bullseye or the archer or the arrow. It means aiming, trying to hit the bullseye. All right, so now I want to go to the Torah for which, if we learn it, action makes sense. I want to start with of all places, the Garden of Eden. I want to quickly describe it in a way we don't usually think of it. What I hear in Eden is the voice speaking on behalf of reality, saying there is amazing abundance here. Eat of it. Take joy in it. Just one thing. Don't gobble it all up. One tree. Just don't eat one tree. The snake back before the snake. The verse before the snake enters the conversation says that the male and female were naked and they weren't ashamed, which I think means they were like children. Sexuality didn't enter, so shame didn't enter, guilt didn't enter, all those. The word for naked for the two of them was arumim, the plural of arum, naked. The next line of Torah says, the snake was the most arum of all the beasts of the field. And every translator says, oh, that arum, that's not naked. That's clever, shrewd. But when I looked at it, just as a writer, I thought, if I had been writing that, I would use that as a kind of flag to notice. Please notice I'm using arum in two successive verses. What if it does mean naked? What would it mean for the snake to say, to be the most naked of all the beasts of the field? So I think the snake is the most naked because it sheds its skin. What could be nakeder than that? And I think the snake goes to the girl about to become a woman and says, oh, they used to think that I was going to die when I shed my skin. I didn't die. I was transformed, but I didn't die. You're going to shed your skin very soon. It's going to be scary. It's going to be bloody. But you know what? You're not going to die. You're just going to be transformed. So the notion you're going to be that you're going to die if you eat from the tree, it's not true. Take the joy of eating from the tree. And the woman growing up, which I think is what the story is about, growing up, becomes an adolescent, does begin to have a menstrual period, and eats from the tree. Now, we know that adolescents need to grow up, and we know that sometimes they make mistakes in the growing up. I think she made a mistake, but not a mortal, a deadly mistake. She ate from the tree. And as a result, two things happen. One is the abundance vanishes because she gobbled up everything. And the other is the voice says, well, part of the abundance vanishing is the voice says, it's going to be that you have to work with the sweat pouring down your faces in order to grow enough food to live. And the earth is going to be reluctant to give that food. It's going to give thorns and thistles instead. Then the voice says, and a hierarchy is going to come into the world, and men are going to rule over women. Now, the first one, nobody ever thought was a command. Like, don't make a rake, don't make a hoe, don't make a harvester, because it would ease your work in making food. People thought, oh, it was a consequence, but not a command. We should learn to transcend the consequence. We should learn to make tools that ease the work without gobbling up everything on the planet. But the second one, some folks decided, and Christianity was a guy named Augustine, who Catholic Christianity calls a saint. I won't call him a saint. I think he made a profound, disastrous, and disgusting mistake. He said that meant men were supposed to rule over women forever and ever. And sex is the sin of the Garden of Eden and introduces sin. And since the human race depends on it, we make a compromise that only sex that is intended for procreation to continue the human race is okay. But our holiest people, they don't have sex, allegedly. And we forbid any form of sex that is pleasurable but doesn't produce offspring. So that's the disaster of the interpretation of Eden. And I think that the crucial teaching is do take pleasure in the abundance, but don't gobble everything. The story of the Gulf of Mexico 10 years ago last summer is a story of trying to gobble everything. BP tries to gobble everything. Result is 11 of its own workers die in an instant, and a lot of the fish and wildlife and flying life of the Gulf of Mexico dies as a result of overreach, of gobbling everything. So I think it's a story that's intended, it must have been written by farmers, that story intended to say, hey, take joy in the abundance, but don't gobble everything. All right, so now I want to go to what I think the next two big stories. When power gets centered in a guy named Pharaoh, Emperor Pharaoh, he not only oppresses human beings into slavery, but he oppresses the earth. And as we really know, if we pay attention to what we're living through, oppression of human beings and oppression of the earth are not divided, they're united. So he oppresses the earth, and the earth responds with what we call plagues, disasters for most of Egypt, and liberating for the folks who live off in a different ecosystem called Goshen. And the first thing that happens when the folks who are not overwhelmed but liberated by the plagues get on the other side of that sea, the first thing that happens is they say, we're hungry, what are we going to eat? And there comes the manna, which really, if you look at the story, manna is not a translation. It's just a repetition. They didn't know what to call it. They didn't know, they'd never seen anything like it. They called it manhu. What's that? If it were being translated, we would say, what's that? But I guess the King James translators couldn't imagine just calling it what's that. So they called it manhu, only in English, manna. And manna means the world is abundant. It is full of joy. And you can eat of it without gobbling it all. In fact, if you try to gobble too much any day of the week, it rots and it stinks. But on the sixth day, if you gather twice as much as you need for a day, that's fine. It won't rot and it won't stink, because on the seventh day, you're supposed to rest. That's the first time Shabbat comes into the world. It's a kind of response to the miseducation of Pharaoh. I can do whatever I want with the earth. I can do whatever I want with human beings. I'm a God. The deep process of the breath of life says, no, you're not in charge. Only the breath of life is in charge. And then we learn practice of Shemitah, the practice of letting the earth rest every seventh year, as well as every seventh day. And that becomes the policy, that becomes the doing that comes out of the teaching of Eden and of manna, that if manna becomes the teaching of the seventh day, and the story, a parable, is to teach us that point, then the people figure out to make a whole year. So I just want to say one more thing. I think there is one element of the Hebrew Bible that looks beyond, to try to imagine a world in which the ethic of love, rather than the ethic of competition and control and domination, has grown, not perfect, but overwhelmingly what human beings learn. In other words, a kind of Garden of Eden for a grown-up human race, really grown up. And I think the Song of Songs, with A, women are not subordinate, but fully equal. B, Mama, Papa, God ain't even there. That is, there's no name of God, not even Yod Vav in the Song of Songs, because the people have all taken the ethic of love inside. They don't need Mama, Papa to tell them, don't gobble. They got it. They got it deep within themselves. They love the earth. The earth loves them. They love each other. They celebrate each other's bodies in a loving, not in a rapacious way. So I think that's the vision. I gave a speech once at Chautauqua, which is a kind of amazing, every summer until COVID, it becomes a spiritual renewal center with about 10,000 people, a whole town of people searching for spiritual renewal. It's in upper New York State, near Erie. I was asked to give a speech here on radicalism. What is radicalism? So I said, radicalism, I dressed in red shirt and white pants. I said, I'm dressed in red and white because that's the color of a radish. A radish and radical come from the same root, and the root means root. Radish is a root, and radicalism is about going to the root. I said, for me, Torah is the root. Then I gave the whole talk like this. And then somebody, wise guy from the audience, thought he could catch the rabbi in a contradiction. He says, well, if the Torah is your root, what do you make of the line that says, be fruitful, multiply, fill up the earth and subdue it? I said, done. Now what? We have been fruitful, multiplied, and filled up the earth and subdued it. Now what? I think the Song of Songs is a piece of now what? And it will take a whole new understanding of Torah to make it make sense in a world where we don't gobble and don't want to, but we love the earth. We open ourselves so the earth can love us. We love each other. We don't suppress half the human race. We transcend it. We grew up. We will grow up. That's what I think the hope is. And at last, either we grow up or we die. Okay, so I'm done. Debarti. When I do something with Kaddish to Rabbanan, it's kind of interesting. Just as the study of Torah starts with a pretty short bracha and ends with a longer one, just like eating ends with a short bracha and begins with a short bracha and ends with a long one. So what are we invited to do in Kaddish to Rabbanan? First of all, it begins with two reflexive verbs, Yiskadal v'Yiskadash, Shmei Rabbah, the great name. For years, I could not figure out what on earth the great name meant. What's your name? The great name. That's my name. What? That's even weirder than Yud Hey. Until I visited the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., which has about 60,000 names of the American dead in the Vietnam War. And they all become one great name. So I realized, maybe the great name is the name that includes all the names of all the beings in the universe, past, present, future, all the names. That's the great name, because we're all connected. It's not just a blip here and a blob there. We're all connected in the great name. And then the Yiskadal, the Yiskadash, the reflexive verb, means us. It's we who have to lift and make more holy the great name, because we're part of it. And the great name is that name which also always, always, always teaches and always, always, always learns. In Hebrew, the root's the same. In English doesn't get it. That teaching and learning are different facets of the same process. So I invite you to remember some moment or moments, plural, when you were taught, maybe by a human being, maybe by a full moon or the squawk of a parrot or the breathing of an elm tree or the croak of a frog. When you learn something in that moment, and give the moment a name, part of the great name. And now think of some moment when you were the teacher, the change maker. Maybe you taught or changed a human being. Maybe a plant that you grew and protected. Maybe an animal. Maybe something that officially would be considered inanimate, without soul. That's what inanimate means, like a mountain or a river. Not true that they're inanimate. So think of that moment as well, those moments as well. Connect them. These moments are not just separate. They are all part of the great name. So weave them together. Then lift up your own name and find exactly the right place in what you've woven, to gently place your own name. So your name is part of the great name. And then take everything you've woven and put it inside you. So the great name is within you. Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Tamidei v'al Tamidei Tamidehon, for the God wrestling folk, and for all who gather to breathe the great breath with each other, to aim toward wisdom with each other, in any language, any culture. For our teachers, the rabbis, the prophets, the priests, and the moon, and the frogs, and all the other teachers. For their students, including ourselves. And for all the students of their students, including those whom we teach. For all who gather anywhere on earth in any language to breathe together words that aim toward wisdom. May there be blessings. The blessing of chesed, of loving kindness, as we open our unaccustomed ears and hearts to hear what each other say. The blessing of shalom, of wholeness, as we begin to try to integrate what we hear in all its differences, integrate them into something that for us is whole. The blessing of knowing that there is work to do in the world, work for our own and for others' livelihoods, and that we can do that work not on the backs of earth or on the backs of other human beings, but as part of earth and part of the human community. And the blessing of knowing that there's also time to rest, to dance, to love, to make love, to sing, to play. And the blessing of knowing that by gathering together to breathe words together, we come closer to becoming part of that great breath that is the Holy One. And let us say, Amen.
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 Amen. And thank you for the opportunity for speaking with you. And I hope you're speaking with each other will carry that blessing many steps further. You will.
My heart is so full from your beautiful teaching, Rabbi Waskow, that I actually have no words.
There's also a line in the Psalms that says, for you, for you, silence is praise. So that's okay too. That's part of, we breathe when we're silent. It's not really silent, it's just the soft.